For 10 years, Prince Andrew represented the United Kingdom as a roving trade ambassador. He flew around the world on private jets, stayed in luxury hotels, met with oligarchs and dictators, and cost British taxpayers millions. And when it was all over, the government quietly asked him to step down. No fanfare. No thank you. Just, please stop. What happened during those 10 years? Why did a role meant to boost British business become a source of embarrassment? And what does this tell us about judgment, accountability, and the cost of unchecked privilege? By the end of this video, you'll understand how one prince's failures reveal something much bigger about power, responsibility, and the consequences of surrounding yourself with the wrong people. Let's dive in. The year is 2001. Prince Andrew, Duke of York, is given a role that sounds perfect for him: UK's Special Representative for International Trade and Investment. Think about it. Andrew was charismatic, well-connected, and as a prince, he had automatic access to world leaders and business elites. The idea was that he'd use his royal status to open doors for British businesses, promote UK trade, and help generate economic opportunities. On paper, it made sense. The royal family is supposed to serve the nation, and what better service than helping British companies succeed globally? Andrew threw himself into the role. He traveled constantly, to the Middle East, to Central Asia, to China, to the United States. He attended conferences, hosted events, and networked with some of the world's wealthiest and most powerful people. But here's the thing. From almost the beginning, questions started to emerge. Not about Andrew's effort. He clearly worked hard, but about his judgment, about who he was meeting with, about what these trips were actually accomplishing, and about whether taxpayers were getting value for money. Before we go further, if you want to understand how power really works behind the scenes, hit that subscribe button. We're about to pull back the curtain on a decade of questionable decisions. Andrew's travel expenses as trade envoy were astronomical. He flew by private jet or in luxury class. He stayed in five-star hotels, sometimes the most expensive suites. He traveled with a full entourage. In 2010 alone, his travel costs were reported to be around £500,000. That's over $600,000 in a single year, paid for by British taxpayers. The British media started calling him Air Miles Andy. The nickname stuck because it captured something essential about how he operated. Not like a civil servant working for the public good, but like a prince enjoying the perks of his position. Now, you might say, well, he's a prince. He needs security. He needs to travel in style to maintain the image. Fair point. But here's the problem. Other trade envoys and diplomats managed to do their jobs without nearly the same expense. And more importantly, it wasn't clear what the UK was getting in return. Where were the major trade deals Andrew had secured? Where were the success stories? The government couldn't point to concrete results that justified the massive cost. But the lifestyle issues were just the beginning. The real problems were about who Andrew was spending time with and what that said about his judgment. And this is where the story gets really uncomfortable. During his time as trade envoy, Prince Andrew developed relationships with some extremely controversial figures. Let me walk you through the most damaging ones. First, there was Tariq Khaitouni, a convicted Libyan gun smuggler. Andrew invited him to Buckingham Palace. When this was revealed, the palace claimed Andrew didn't know about Khaitouni's background. But that raises the question, why wasn't proper vetting being done? This is a trade envoy representing the UK, and he's bringing convicted criminals into the palace? Then there was Saker El Materi, the son-in-law of Tunisia's dictator, Zine El Abidine Ben Ali. Andrew was photographed visiting Materi's palatial home shortly before the Tunisian Revolution in 2011. The optics were terrible, a British prince cozying up to the family of a dictator while the Tunisian people were suffering under authoritarian rule. And perhaps most significantly, there was Timur Kulibayev, a Kazakh billionaire and son-in-law of Kazakhstan's authoritarian president. In 2007, Andrew sold his marital home, Sunninghill Park, to Kulibayev for £15 million, £3 million above the asking price. The house had been on the market for 5 years with no buyers, and suddenly, right after Andrew helped facilitate business deals involving Kazakhstan, it sells for above asking price to a Kazakh oligarch. The perception of impropriety was impossible to ignore. It looked like Andrew was using his position to enrich himself. Even if everything was technically legal, the judgment was appalling. But the association that would ultimately define Andrew's downfall was with Jeffrey Epstein. Epstein was a financier with connections to powerful people worldwide. Andrew met him in the 1990s, and they developed a friendship. In 2000, Epstein was photographed at Windsor Castle with Ghislaine Maxwell and Andrew. This was during Andrew's time as trade envoy. In 2008, Epstein was convicted of soliciting prostitution from a minor. Most people would have immediately distanced themselves, but Andrew didn't. In 2010, 2 years after the conviction, Andrew was photographed walking with Epstein in Central Park. The palace's explanation? Andrew was there to end the friendship in person. But even if that's true, the judgment to continue any association with Epstein after his conviction was catastrophic. Here's what this pattern reveals. Andrew consistently failed to understand optics, consequences, and the responsibilities that came with his position. He seemed to believe that because he was a prince, the normal rules didn't apply to him. And for a while, he was right, because nobody stopped him. In 2010, WikiLeaks released U.S. diplomatic cables that painted an even more damaging picture of Andrew's conduct. One cable, written by Tatiana Gfoler, the U.S. ambassador to Kyrgyzstan, described a business lunch with Andrew that she found deeply troubling. According to her account, Andrew made inappropriate jokes, complained about corruption investigators in the UK who had the idiocy to investigate bribes paid by British companies, and spoke rudely about the Serious Fraud Office, the very body tasked with investigating corruption. He reportedly said that British courts and anti-corruption investigators were bad for business and were undermining the UK's ability to compete with countries like France, where such investigations didn't happen. Think about what that means. A UK trade envoy, representing British interests, was essentially arguing against anti-corruption measures because they made it harder to compete with countries willing to pay bribes. The cable described Andrew as speaking cockily and being rude about other countries, including France and the United States. Ambassador Gfoler noted that other guests at the lunch were shocked by his behavior. This wasn't a one-off. Another cable described Andrew speaking dismissively about journalists and expressing contempt for anti-corruption efforts. The picture that emerged was of someone who was out of his depth, undiplomatic, and fundamentally misunderstood what his role was supposed to be. This is someone who was born into privilege, who had never had to compete for a job or face real consequences for poor performance, and who seemed to believe that his royal status gave him license to say and do whatever he wanted. And here's the kicker. Even after these cables were published, even after the embarrassment they caused the UK government, Andrew continued in his role for another year. It wasn't until 2011, as the Epstein scandal continued to grow and public pressure mounted, that Buckingham Palace finally announced Andrew would be stepping down as trade envoy. So let's talk about what Andrew's tenure as trade envoy actually cost the United Kingdom. First, the financial cost. Millions of pounds in travel expenses, security, and support over 10 years. And for what? The government couldn't point to major trade agreements or significant economic wins that Andrew had secured. Second, the reputational cost. Britain's image as a country committed to anti-corruption, rule of law, and ethical business practices was undermined by its trade envoy hobnobbing with dictators, criminals, and convicted sex offenders. Third, the opportunity cost. Imagine if the UK had a trade envoy who was genuinely effective, who focused on substantive economic diplomacy rather than lavish networking events. What opportunities were missed because Andrew was in that role? But here's what's most frustrating. Andrew's failures as trade envoy were a preview of the bigger scandal to come. The Epstein Association, which should have been a warning sign in 2010, would eventually lead to Andrew's complete removal from public life. Every questionable decision, every association with corrupt or criminal figures, every example of poor judgment, they all pointed to the same fundamental problem. Andrew believed he was above scrutiny. And the institutions around him, the palace, the government, the advisory teams, enabled that belief for far too long. When Andrew finally stepped down in 2011, there was no accountability. No investigation into whether any laws were broken. No public accounting of what had gone wrong. Just a quiet exit and the hope that everyone would forget about it. But we shouldn't forget. Because this story teaches us something important about how privilege, unchecked power, and a lack of accountability can lead to failure after failure with no real consequences. Now let's talk about why this matters beyond just one prince's incompetence. Lesson 1. Judgment matters more than connections. Andrew had incredible access. He could get meetings with anyone in the world. But access without good judgment is worse than useless. It's dangerous. He used his access to build relationships with people who damaged Britain's reputation. In your own life, think about this. It's not about who you know. It's about who you choose to associate with and what those associations say about your values. Your network is a reflection of your judgment. Andrew failed at his job for a decade before finally stepping down. And even then, he faced no real consequences. He kept his titles, his royal status, his wealth. He just stopped doing one particular role that he was bad at. Without real consequences, there's no incentive to change. This is true in any organization, any family, any relationship. If behavior doesn't have consequences, the behavior continues. Andrew seemed genuinely shocked when people criticized him. He couldn't understand why his associations with Epstein or oligarchs were problematic. Because in his world, those were just the people you knew. When you're born into privilege, when you've never had to worry about money or access or opportunity, it's easy to lose touch with how your actions appear to everyone else. This is a warning for anyone in a position of advantage. You need people around you who will tell you the truth, who will push back, who will say, "This is a bad idea." Andrew apparently didn't have those people. Or if he did, he didn't listen to them. The initial associations with questionable people were bad, but the continued defense of those associations, the refusal to acknowledge poor judgment, the doubling down, that's what made it unforgivable. When you make a mistake, the path forward is to acknowledge it, take responsibility, and do better. Andrew never did that. And that's why his failure as trade envoy is still relevant years later. So where's the motivation in this story? Because this channel isn't about tearing people down. It's about understanding power, learning lessons, and getting better. Here's what inspires me about this story. Even though it's a story of failure, we're living in a time when people are demanding accountability from powerful institutions and individuals. The fact that we can even have this conversation, that we can scrutinize a prince's performance and find it wanting, that represents progress. 50 years ago, this would have been swept under the rug. The cables would never have been published. The public would never have known about the questionable associations or the wasted taxpayer money. But we live in an age of transparency. WikiLeaks, investigative journalism, social media, these tools make it harder for powerful people to operate without scrutiny. That's good. That's how we get better institutions. That's how we create accountability. You don't have to be a prince to learn from this. In fact, most of us will never have Andrew's access or privilege. But we all make choices about how we use whatever power or position we have. The question is, are we using it wisely? Are we building relationships that reflect our values? Are we open to being wrong? Those are the questions that determine whether we succeed or fail in the roles we've been given. Prince Andrew's decade as trade envoy is a masterclass in how not to use privilege, access, and position. It's a reminder that titles don't make you competent. That royal blood doesn't give you good judgment. That without accountability, even the most prestigious roles can become hollow.